Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. And I am delighted today to welcome back Jerry Kantor. Hello, Jerry.
Hello, Anna.
You have written this fabulous book, which we kind of began to just skate around in our last conversation about homeopathy. It's called Sane Asylums, and here it is. And it is a wonderful history of homeopathy, but it also shows what's possible. Because the very reason why I was so interested in the book we did discuss in the last interview is because we were looking at not just physical illnesses, but emotional conditions too. And here we have this amazing account of history uh, of homeopathy, which encompasses mind and body. So, um, I'm just wondering what led you to explore this history?
Originally I thought that I would write a history of the homeopathic hospitals in this country, and I quickly realized that was a foolish idea because there are thousands of them, and I wasn't up to it, just way too many. I couldn't believe how popular homeopathy was, with thousands of pharmacies where homeopaths would practice and all these hospitals. So I narrowed it down to just the homeopathic mental asylums. And then I found that that was itself a very worthy topic, um, pretty much completely ignored uh, by conventional historians. And I just was absolutely astonished by it, by their power, their popularity, um, their influence on society. The fact that they were utopian, that they were based in both homeopathy and what was called the moral care movement, but far better than other hospitals that didn't use homeopathy, which called themselves moral care asylums. And I couldn't resist going into it. And the stories that were part of that were just so fascinating, especially around Middletown Hospital in New York, which was the mother church, which grew to an enormous size, and all these um, renowned homeopaths cycled through it as assistants to the superintendent Selden Talcott, who I dedicated this book to, who I think deserves to be considered the greatest psychiatrist America has ever had, and is barely known for that from that perspective anymore. The baseball team that he created there for the edification of the clients, he found that when people watched baseball, they were better. It focused their attention. It was just a cool thing to notice on his part. And he created a very powerful baseball team that played even major league teams. Um, I found that in the course of this study, that Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's widow, who was judged incurably insane by in a sensational trial, that she was probably cured of her insanity by a homeopath at a little what I call a sane asylum in Illinois. It's a story that's never been told. So that was a journalistic coup. Um, I challenge anyone to go and review my account and take it apart. Um, but there's not really much interest in it. The facts are so compelling and so interesting about these enormously popular asylums, which were financed by the state. Frankly, the state was very happy to send inebriates there, people with syphilitic insanity there, every kind of mental problem. Because in the wake of the Civil War, much of the country went crazy from grief. So much carnage. Um, and so and drunkenness in this country too, and later stages of alcoholism was a big problem at that time. People like that wound up in these asylums, and they weren't kicked out. They weren't sent back into their dysfunctional families or the distressful situations. They just could stay there as long as they liked. The nursing care was fabulous under especially at Middletown Hospital, under the supervision of Clara Barris, who was a genius nurse educator, and the companion, a colleague of Selden Talcott in Middletown. I contrast her with the other Clara Barr, Clara um, Barton, who was considered the nurse of the battlefield It's funny that they both have such similar names. But Clara Barris wrote a fantastic book called Nursing the Insane, which I still maintain is one of the greatest nursing books ever written, and probably one of the best holistic medicine books ever written. And she educated the nurses in engaging with the inmates' um, mental health issues very directly. There was not an option to drug them up and just warehouse them there. She engaged with them, taught the nurses how to be respectful of the inmates there, engaged with them through what was called moral hygiene. But she was very creative. She had giggle classes. She did all kinds of creative things to get to entertain them, to wake them up, to direct them to something useful to do. She was absolutely a genius, and the nurses were of a very, very high quality under her supervision. So she's very well known in another aspect as being the muse of a famous naturalist in America, who she was his companion in later years, his muse, curator of his papers. But this part of her life, where she was a homeopathic physician at Middletown Hospital for I think 15 years, that story has never really been amplified and broadcast, and I was very pleased to give her due. In later life, she became a psychotherapist. She's a very, very many faceted woman, Clara Barris. I feel very privileged to have told her story in this book. Um, but this hospital had, thousands of documented treatments of these clients. And I delved the records, got, where the privacy considerations were not active because the clients were kept anonymous. And we could see the power of the treatments. And Selden Talcott's work, if you're working homeopaths today, his Materia Medica is still in use. We still use it. Things he said about the remedies still apply. And they did many things beyond homeopathy, which are very advanced in terms of paying attention to diet, getting people rest, giving them activities to do, and gardening and becoming useful. Some stayed a long time. Some came out, within a few months. But the contrast with how mental health care is dealt with today was just very, very, very great.
Listening to you, you talk about the contrast with how mental health is handled today. It's making me think about the contrast with how mental health was also in its day the alternative model, which would have been to basically just throw people into asylums without a great deal of understanding of what these symptoms were. So I guess really we begin with the need to have some sort of working definition of what mental illness, or in that time, insanity, would have been.
I'm laughing. I considered that problem because it was quite different from how it is today. The conditions were different. The way I handled that was at the end of my book, I have an appendix section called Compendium of Madness Perspectives, which really deserves to be an encyclopedia of its own terms, where I decide to look at madness from many, many cultural and medical perspectives, and you could get to see how daunting a problem that is. Um, ultimately, I'm so ultimately have to say that I come down to the side of Thomas Zaz, a psychiatrist from the 1960s who was very renowned because of his attack on the psychiatric profession. That insanity is really impossible to define, and it's probably the wrong thing to do it because so much of it involves just people who are inconvenient to other people with their opinions. They're difficult to understand because of the shock that they have gone through, which could be remediated through many things other than regular drugs. Exhaustion. I have this very simplified idea about what madness is, frankly, which is the convergence of shock, exhaustion, and the narrowing of a point of view. And those things in converging under certain circumstances will create what is considered to be, those days they called it dementia praecox, or now they would call it psychosis or schizophrenia. But the point is that in those asylums where you had people seriously concerned with the well-being of the clients, and they treated them with respect, and they really tried to engage their mental illness gradually, in these discussions, these moral hygiene kinds of discussions, give them something useful, give them good food, let them rest. They could overcome these three aspects of what I call mental illness, which is a narrowing of perspective, the shock, of a trauma and exhaustion. They didn't resort to straitjackets. They didn't resort to, well, if someone was extremely violent under very rare circumstances, they would have to do that if the person was a genuine coming in was a genuine threat to someone else. But they didn't torture them in the way it was done in other hospitals, even in the moral care movement we're talking about. Um, and I drew contrasts with other hospitals which called themselves moral care facilities, where they still did horrible things to the clients. But yeah, it is difficult to describe to define what madness is, and I think it's unnecessary, frankly.
And I think, I asked the question for exactly that reason. It's because how many times do people casually use the word or accuse somebody of being mad because they have a perspective that is so different from their own? And I think this is the definition of mental illness is very difficult. For that reason, it's highly subjective. And, R.D. Laing had something to say about this. And as you said, others have too, where you can put somebody in who is perfectly sane in what is considered to be a mental health hospital, and their behavior is, considered to be delusional, denying that they have a problem, etc., etc., because they're not conforming to the view of what they should be like. So there's been plenty of evidence over the years that shows that this is an extremely problematic issue, which is why I was so fascinated to read that here we are in the 19th and early 20th century with a very holistic approach to mental health.
Um, of course, that's a wonderful thing to do in a society that's liberal. Unfortunately, the idea of punitive psychiatry is has not died. It's a terrible abuse where people are put into mental hospitals because they are um, opposed to a political system. In the United States, it's embarrassing even to say this. There was a doctor who declared that runaway slaves were insane, and they made up a name for it. I think drapetomania, which means to run away, and uh, and he was completely stone sober when he thought this out. He thought, well, don't they understand that they're so much better off in a plantation than running wild as uncivilized savages? They must be completely insane. You'd think this is sarcastic or something like that, but it actually it remained on the books as a medical condition, I think, in some places until the 1950s. I think that term really is very instructive because a version of that is operative in punitive psychiatry, where it's where people who are opposed to the government are put away in Russia and China and various places. It's terrible. But as even in liberal places where we just want to treat the mentally ill more sanely, the way they're dealt with now in the current state of hospitals, where the people are warehoused basically and then shipped home in these addicted types of states, it doesn't really solve the problem, and it perpetuates the problem. And treating mental health is difficult, but it can be done. I mean, again, a lot of my clients say, where can I send so and so? Was there not one of these sane asylums around? Where I'd love to go to one, And I say, well, I may have to do a gigantic crowdsourcing project to obtain millions and millions of dollars to do this. And of course, people have to live there too. There's a lot of things about that now that would make it very difficult. People have to live in those facilities, all kinds of caregivers and nurses and physicians to make that work.
I think, I see this as rehabilitation. And it's interesting because it's making me think of in this country, post First World War, how the use of hypnosis was extremely um, common in treatment of shell shock, and a lot of the conditions that men were coming home with as a result of the trauma of trench warfare. And but it was this idea that you rehabilitate the person. And I think if we're talking about mental illness, we need to say, well, it's something has happened to this person that has upset them to the point where they're finding it difficult to function in everyday life. And you were talking about people returning to their normal life, and then the whole problem starting up again. Well, I seem to remember R.D. Laing's Sanity and Madness in the Family, where he was talking about schizophrenia, and he described exactly that. He came to the conclusion that it was the environment that was actually contributing to this, shall we call it, malfunction, where people would go into the institutions, be perfectly fine, come out, go into the family, and the whole thing would start all over again. So this is a concept that's there. And really, we do need to understand the part that the environment that the individual finds themselves in is playing, and the need to come back to some sort of calm within themselves if they're going to go out and function in society again.
You mentioned shell shock. That gives me an opportunity to make a little segue here. The modern diagnoses which have proliferated in the margin in the course of the marginalizing homeopathy. Homeopathy uses very concrete diagnoses which have a very strong emotional component to them. They say something about the mental state of a person. Those diagnoses, in fact, have been neutered for the purposes of modern medicine. I'll give you an example, because the idea is that everybody's exactly the same, and abnormality is a deviation from the normal state, and the important things that we're all alike. In homeopathy, we believe the opposite. We think what really matters is the individuality of the person, and much more than the diagnosis. So shell shock, that term is not used anymore. It's been replaced by PTSD, because anyone can have a traumatic experience, and then we're not interested in what the person is underneath that. But the word shell shock is interesting to me, because it incorporates the idea that you're not just traumatized, but there's something happened to your hearing. It came through the ears. Now, in Chinese medicine, the ears are the outlet of the kidneys, and within that element that pertains to that which is water, the fear is the absolute central emotion there. So the connection between the emotion of fear, and the kidneys is hardwired in Chinese medicine. So there's something significant that's left out when you remove from shell shock this idea that the trauma is through the ear primarily. This is very apropos now, because a few months ago there were all these articles in the paper about how I think the Green Berets or some branch of the military is being trained, and they have to listen to they're exposed to the tremendous amount of artillery noise, and they're winding up in mental hospitals, and the military doesn't seem to know how to stop this aspect of the training, and it's just referred to as PTSD, but they're not talking about the noise aspect. Now, in World War I, what this gave birth to, back to what you said about helping people, there was a woman who decided on her own that the soldiers, the veterans with shell shock, needed to hear music. And so she would go and she played music for them. And this was the birth of music therapy, a very good thing. And it's also homeopathic in the sense that you're introducing the junior version of noise, a very gentle version of noise, through the therapy through the ear with music. Anyway, so I'm beating the drum about the old diagnoses that have been discarded that homeopaths still make extensive use of in their rubrics. As I say, shell shock's a good term.
It is. And actually, what you said about the need for specificity, as opposed to a generalized diagnosis like PTSD, is absolutely right. You quite succinctly brought it back to fear. And if you think about it, this is a noise that is extremely aggressive and a shock to the system in conditions that are life-threatening. So you have this extraordinary aggressive sound paired with the possibility of losing life. And the suggestion now, of course, is that any loud sound is going to be life-threatening. So yes, absolutely. But it also made me think about an interview I heard with Jordan Peterson some time ago, in which he was talking about PTSD, but in the context of Vietnam servicemen. And he was talking about how we would assume that the PTSD they were experiencing was due to fear, but also due to the shock of what they had witnessed. But actually, he was talking about it being very different, that in his experience, it was more to do with guilt over actions that they had done and the absolute horror of what they had done as soldiers. Now that's very different from the fear that you've identified in shell shock, and yet both would have the same diagnosis of PTSD. So this is a nuance that is really rather important.
Glad you mentioned that. I mean, homeopathy just is so accommodating to these individual differences. And I'll be very specific. The remedy stramonium is exactly the remedy that you would use for what's called PTSD, where someone has witnessed some terrible violence. And we have to prescribe this for children who have rageful tantrums in this country. When I take the case of a child like that, invariably, this child has witnessed the father beating the mother, some horrible thing. And this is through the eyesight. This is a trauma that is through the eyesight. Of course, trauma takes many, many forms. But a stramonium child, homeopathy has, as again, these very specific kind of rubrics. Someone like that will be very triggered by seeing shiny objects, you know, and they will have a beseeching quality to their rage. If I were to describe the other aspects of that remedy state, the core idea of that is the feeling of having been abandoned in the wilderness. So yes, they've seen something horrifying, but the impact of them on their psyche is that they're unprotected and they've been abandoned in the wilderness. And so their rage represents something very specific. It represents a feeling of, I need to access my inner monster in order to survive the situation. That's what's going on. And when we deconstruct it, it's because they have witnessed something horrible, and they're terrified of the dark. That would make a great deal of sense. They hate and their rage erupts out of the subconscious, with horrible violence. But it's really the flip side of fear. And this is trauma through the eyes. This is not through the ears primarily. And homeopathy can adapt to that very easily.
So I guess, another condition which would have a very broad diagnosis would be alcoholism. I think that's another really good example. This is a broad diagnosis. It's describing a behavior of addiction, but the reasons why somebody might drink will vary from individual to individual.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. In fact, my next book is probably going to be about these diagnostic changes. Early on, was it inebriation? Dipsomania. The term dipsomania is no longer used, but there was a big discussion, nationwide discussion, I guess I think when this was probably in the late 1800s, whether alcoholism was a disease or a bad habit. It was a nationwide discussion, and it's appropriate still today. This is another term that's been discarded, dipsomania, and we have alcohol withdrawal syndrome or something like that. And again, the idea is everybody is exactly the same, and you crave alcohol as an addiction, and that's a disease, and we should medicate it, or so forth. But that's not the case. The way homeopaths look at it, if you need a remedy like lachesis, your addiction is related to a lot of the things that Freud wrote about. Need to suppress one's instincts. People who feel like have incredibly strong internal emotions, and they turn to alcohol because that's the only way that they can suppress their feelings, which is demanded by society. We think of some other kinds of states or other remedies where the alcoholism is tied into an intense sense of guilt. In fact, the snake remedies in general have this aspect where there's a need to control one's feelings very powerfully, because if you acted on them, you'd be violent or inappropriate in your behaviors. So that we can look at alcoholism in several ways, and that's the way that enables us to prescribe accurately. If we just said, you're all exactly the same, and you stamp with this diagnosis, alcoholic, we could never practice efficiently like that in the homeopathic world.
No, and I think it accounts for the struggle that so many people have with addiction, because there's this very broad brush that's being used, and it's very difficult for them to break free, because actually what is at the heart of it is emotions, and
Yeah.
and very often trauma.
Yeah. If I were to talk about all the homeopathic ways of treating alcoholism, that would be several-hour discussion, because I could name you at least half a dozen remedies, probably a dozen remedies that play into it in different ways. And like the physicians in those homeopathic sane asylums, they had to find the correct remedy. By the way, Selden Talcott, uh, before he became the superintendent of the Middletown Asylum, was in charge of a homeopathic hospital in New York for inebriates. And so he used alcoholism. I mean, used homeopathy to treat them there, and he was very successful in this particular hospital in New York City. That was the stepping stone to when he became the superintendent of the Middletown Hospital in New York.
The idea of these wonderful places that help to bring people back into balance within themselves is wonderful. However, most of us who are helping people who are struggling with one thing or another have to help them in the context of their lives, because they're not going to leave their families, because they have responsibilities. They can't just take time off work. So, in your view, can homeopathy still be supportive of a person, let's say, who is suffering from alcoholism, um, and help them within the context of their daily lives that they're finding difficult to deal with?
Oh, unquestionably. That's why homeopaths have full practices. The asylums, let me be clear, people who went there were in very, very extreme states. I mean, there's a reason why those hospitals were called asylum for the insane. People were in very dire straits, completely exhausted, useless, could not function, highly delusional. But I treat alcoholism. I've treated all, various kinds of addiction successfully in my practice. The big problem is creating a game plan such that the homeopathic can supplant maybe the other more pharmaceutically related ways of treating them. So we can get traction with a client. The homeopathy is kind of humble. It only works, it simply unleashes a reaction inside the person that wants to happen. It has the humble task of issuing a kind of permission slip to the subconscious to let go of the issue that is fueling the alcoholism. So you don't just people are not cars. We just simply replace parts and then they're okay. There's something we have to excavate. I call it spiritual forensics, digging down deep to see how this originated. And if we're dealing with remedies such as sulfinum or meteorinum, the necessity for remedies like that indicates that there's a legacy that's operating in this person. In other words, it's not something that just happened in this lifetime, but something a problem that they're carrying from earlier generations. They are entangled with the issues of an ancestor. So that's deep work. But this is what homeopaths have learned to do. We deal with chronic illness. We have to do this. No one is born as a blank slate in basically just where your life is impacted. We have what I call fault lines or hot buttons, and life slams a hammer on these things and brings the issue out more clearly, which involves if it's not dealt with appropriately, it can evolve into a chronic illness. But yeah, well, as outpatient, everyone's an outpatient now, and homeopaths have to deal with this, and we do. This is why we're successful. We don't have these kinds of asylums anymore, unfortunately. We don't.
No. So, talk us through the process that you go through with a client to determine what they need.
Oh, sure. Um, I've gotten into the habit of asking for a mini biography in advance. It's not mandatory, but I like doing it. I got into that habit during but when I was treating a lot of autism, and of course, autistic clients are not great narrators of their life, and I rely on the parents' a description of what has happened from birth on, or if there are legacies in the family. I get as much information as I can ahead of time. But if they don't do that, they can just come to me, and within the hour and a half of the first session, I find out a lot of interesting things. It's kind of a magical number, 90 minutes. I try to relax my client as much as possible, make it informal, um, because I never know ahead of time what's going to get me excited about them. It's usually going to be something the person thinks is highly unimportant. Much of the art of doing homeopathy is finding out, listen, not just hearing what the client says, but what they can't say or what they don't want to say, what they're hiding. That's where the gold is. So the tells for that would be their symptoms, first of all, which homeopaths can deconstruct because their gestures, their complexion, um, the way they have their hair, the skin, all of these things are indicators, or if they talk too fast or talk too slow, or if they don't like to answer questions, all these things already compel to send a homeopath in some direction or other. Anyway, but I do like to hear the life story, and I pay certain attention to certain things that will always interest me, like if there's been divorce in the family. I mean, I don't even know if we're talking about an adult or a child, what the traumas have been, the upheavals, the losses, the dark side of things will interest me. And then in the course of hearing these things, I'll start asking peculiar questions. The client will find it very peculiar. And that just means I'm differentiating between one or two remedies. And it's a funnel. Like you're kind of going down a tunnel here and gradually discarding remedies that you know do not apply until you get to the one that really does matter, or the two or three, and then you have to decide between them. The metaphor for this would be like toggling between a wide angle lens and a very close focus lens. Um, the books you toggle between are the homeopathic repertory, which is this amazing book, which is a compendium of all these rubrics, descriptions of human symptoms and behaviors. There have been some great homeopaths like Kent and Boninghausen who created these kind of books. And then the opposite of that is the Materia Medica, which is a detailed description of the particular remedy that has these symptoms. So homeopaths have to toggle between these two books until they get down to the two or three remedies that they're deciding between, and then they prescribe that. What I do is I explain the theme of the remedy to the client as a way of gauging one way of determining that it's accurate. If the person says, "Oh my God, you got me," that's exactly what happened. How did you know that? That's a good chance. That's a good remedy. If they look askance, they say, "I don't know, I got that." Then I continue my investigation. But at the end, um, I have the remedy. I tell them what it's about, how long they can expect to be processing the remedy, because things can get worse before they get better when they take a remedy, because the vital force is engaged with that issue that pertains to it, and you kind of return to the scene of the crime under more favorable circumstances. The vital force engages with something that it had previously given up on, which is what produced their chronic illness in the first place. So it gets a second chance. And I have to explain that and ready the client for going through this. And then I mail it out.
Explain vital force for the audience.
Oh, okay. Vital force. Um, Homeopathy is vitalistic, which means that we believe in energy. We believe in that there is a life force. We don't think that we're just animated corpses walking around. It's a kind of a combination between what's called the subconscious and, well, what is the force? What other word could one use to describe what goes on in human activity, and the fact that we know we're alive, that we have wishes and desires and fears and hopes and appetites. What is that? We call it the vital force. And it includes both mental and emotional symptoms and these more deeply rooted instinctual uh, aspects to ourselves, which are also full of feeling. You can't be hungry without having a bit of an emotion attached to that. Maybe if you're very hungry, the emotion of desperation, you know. So we're reacquainting people with what's absolutely just advanced placement common sense. The idea of separating the mental and the emotional from the physical is absurd, quite frankly. In Chinese medicine, the two things are inextricably, they're hardwired together. If you go visit an acupuncturist, you say, "Oh, my mother died last year." The homeopath will automatically assume you have a lung problem, that this is affecting your lungs. If you have loose stools, the homeopath will so the acupuncturist will automatically assume that you're worrying about something too much, and vice versa. If you're a compulsive worrier, if you're overly anxious, the acupuncturist will pay close attention to how what's going on in your GI tract. These things are hardwired, deeply understood in certain cultures for hundreds of years. So
Uh,
it's always so funny to have to point these things out these days, where these
yes,
distinctions are made.
the subject of a talk I gave only on Saturday, the mind-body connection. So, um,
It shouldn't have been separated in the first place.
I know. So, do you have to see people face to face, or do you work on online with people, video calls?
Just like this. Zoom works well. The transmissions are quite accurate. I can see you very vividly, can hear you quite vividly. Of course, it is. There are situations where it is really good to see people in person. There are things you do pick up in person, and especially if it's a child and the family brings me the child, I get to know the family. If I'm treating a child, actually, almost every time treat at least the mother and often the father as well. Um, it gives me a tremendous window into what's going on there. But I used to joke when I transitioned from acupuncture to homeopathy that I didn't have needles long enough to treat anybody in different states or different parts of the country. But it is very practical for homeopathy to be able to have this form of media that we can work at great distances.
Perfect. So it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you can find Jerry. And I'll be putting a link to this amazing book called Sane Asylums in the description box. Here it is. And if people want to find you to learn more about your work or to have a consultation with you, Jerry, how do they do that?
My practice website, they could go there and contact me through that. Vitalforcehealthcare.com. Oh, by the way, also I've taken to writing a pretty regular blog on Substack. You can find me there, a Right Whale Press Report, and I write about um, numerous developments in healthcare as they might relate to homeopathy. Um, my books are available. You can find them through my publishing website, which is rightwhalepress.com, RIGHTWHALE. But to get to see me and to have an appointment, I would go to the vitalforcehealthcare.com website.
Links for which you will links for which will all be in the description box. Jerry, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, Anna, thank you so much. In return, you're an excellent interviewer, and I always enjoy this.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching. Next time, we will be discussing the subject of consciousness. Until then, goodbye.